She was still holding the bouquet when she sat down across from me. Not beside me, across from me, which meant she wanted to see my face. The small round table near the back of the tent was where I had been sitting alone for the last 20 minutes, working on my second glass of bourbon and pretending to be very interested in the centerpiece, which was a mason jar full of wildflowers and a single candle burning low. Around us, the reception was still going, still loud, the band playing something with a fiddle in it, couples drifting back to the dance floor, her aunt crying happy tears near the cake table, and Nora sat down across from me with $30 worth of white peonies and garden roses in her arms, slightly out of breath, her dark hair coming loose from whatever she had pinned it into that morning, and she looked at me like she had been planning exactly this for longer than the last 60 seconds. "You know what this means," she said. I kept my eyes on her face and said, "It means you have a good vertical leap." She laughed, but she did not look away. She set the bouquet on the table between us, right next to the mason jar, and the two arrangements sat there together in the candlelight, looking almost like they belonged to the same thing. She put both hands flat on the table. She was not nervous. That was the part that undid me, because I was the one who was nervous. I had been nervous for the better part of 3 days, and she was sitting here completely steady, like she had finally gotten to the part of the evening she had been waiting for. "Owen," she said. "Nora, I have a question." I picked up my glass. I took a slow drink. I set it back down. "Okay," I said. She leaned forward just slightly, enough that I could see the small scar above her left eyebrow, the one she got falling off a bike the summer we were 22, the one I had seen so many times it had become part of how I knew her face. "Why?" she said. "Have you been avoiding me since Thursday night?" That was the question. And the honest answer was going to cost me something, which is why I need to back up. Let me back up about 11 years, actually, or at least far enough to explain how a man gets to be 38 years old, sitting in the back of a wedding tent in Portland in late September, holding a bourbon he no longer wants, realizing that the answer to a very simple question is going to change everything or ruin everything, and that there is no version of this moment where he walks away the same person he was before he sat down here tonight. My name is Owen Marsh. I restore furniture for a living. Old furniture, mostly. The kind that ends up in estate sales and antique shops and the back rooms of people's garages. The kind that arrives in my workshop with water stains and cracked joints and 3 generations of paint over the original wood. I work out of a space I rent in a converted warehouse near the Willamette, the kind of building that smells like metal and old grease even after you've spent years filling it with sawdust and linseed oil and the particular mineral smell of stripping solution. It is not glamorous work. It is slow, patient, specific work. You are looking at a thing that someone decided wasn't worth keeping anymore and trying to understand what it actually is beneath all. Have the damage, what it was made to be, whether the structure underneath is sound enough to build back from. Most of the time it is. That is the thing people don't understand about old furniture. Most of the damage is surface. Most of what looks ruined is just years of accumulated neglect that someone finally got around to addressing. People bring me things in all conditions. A cherry secretary desk that sat in a flooded basement for 2 winters, a set of dining chairs with the joints all dried out and the veneer lifting at every corner, a stickly side table that someone's well-meaning grandchild had painted white, then painted yellow, then attempted to sand back down, making it worse at each stage. I take them all. I take them because I understand that every one of them was made by someone who thought it was worth making, that there is an original intention inside the damage if you are willing to look carefully enough and work slowly enough to find it. My job is not to turn a damaged thing into something new. My job is to return it to what it actually is. There is a very specific pleasure in that distinction. Most people don't understand it when I try to explain it. Nora understood it the first time I tried, which is something I noted and then made a deliberate decision not to examine. I have been doing this for 12 years. I learned it from a man named Gerald who used to run a shop in southeast Portland and who had the patience of a man who genuinely did not care how long anything took. Gerald taught me that the first rule of restoration is that you do not start cutting until you know what you have. You look, you feel the grain, you test the joints, you figure out the original intent of the maker before you decide what you're going to do. That rule has served me well in the workshop. It has served me considerably less well in the rest of my life. Gerald also used to say that the most dangerous mistake a restorer can make is deciding what a piece is before you've actually looked at it. He called it pre-reading. You walk in with a conclusion, and you make the evidence fit the conclusion, and you miss the thing that is actually there. I pre-read myself for 11 years. I decided I was a man who was going to keep certain feelings in a safe corner where they wouldn't cause damage, and I made everything I saw fit that conclusion, and I missed what was actually there. I was married once. Her name was Claire, and she was smart and funny, and we got along well for about 4 years before we stopped getting along at all, and it was not dramatic. That is the version of the story people always seem to find hardest to understand. There was no infidelity, no catastrophic fight, no single moment where everything broke. There was just the gradual recognition, which took about 2 more years to become a conversation and then a decision, that we had grown into people who were better suited to different lives. We were kind to each other through it. We are still kind to each other now, in the distant and occasional way of people who genuinely wish each other well and are relieved not to be sharing a bathroom anymore. She lives in Seattle. She remarried 3 years ago. I sent a card. What I kept from the marriage, besides a set of cast-iron pans and a general wariness about my own emotional judgment, was a Windsor chair. It is a comback Windsor, probably from the 1880s, American, with a seat made from a single piece of tulip poplar that someone had painted over no fewer than 6 times. I found it at an estate sale in Beaverton 2 weeks before Claire and I got married. I paid $40 for it and brought it home, and she said it was ugly, and I said it just needed work, and in the end I was right about the chair, and we were both right about ourselves. I brought the chair to my workshop after the divorce and stripped it down to the bare wood and found that the seat was nearly perfect beneath all that paint. A smooth, continuous curve with no splits, and I restored every piece of it except I never finished it. It sat in the corner of my workshop on a low shelf for 3 years, stripped and sanded and structurally sound, with everything done except the final coat. I told myself I was deciding on the right finish. What I was actually doing was not finishing it on purpose, because the chair had become the thing I was not ready to close. A finished chair is a chair that is ready to be used. An unfinished chair is still a project, still in progress, still requiring something from you. I understood what the chair meant by about year 2 of it sitting in that corner, but understanding a thing and doing something about it are 2 separate decisions. I kept it where I could see it. I would sometimes sit across the workshop from it and drink my coffee and look at it the way you look at a conversation you know you need to have eventually. Not avoiding it exactly, just not ready. The wood had darkened slightly from the dust and the time, but the structure was still perfect. That was the thing about it that I kept coming back to. The structure was sound. Everything that needed to be repaired had been repaired. The only thing it lacked was the finish that would seal it and protect it and make it, finally, complete. Nora came into my life 7 months after the divorce was final. She did not come into my life dramatically. That is important to understand about Nora. She does not do things dramatically. She came into my life because her younger sister Becca started dating my friend Cal, and Cal brought her to a dinner at my house because he needed what he called backup, by which he meant he needed someone else there who could carry a conversation so he didn't have to do all the work. Nora showed up at my door in November, wearing a green jacket and carrying a bottle of wine, and she shook my hand and looked around my living room and said, "You restored that credenza yourself, didn't you?" and pointed at the piece against the far wall. And when I said yes, she said, "The finish on the top left corner is slightly lighter than the rest." If you look at it from an angle, she was not being critical. She was just looking. I found out later she had a degree in art history and worked at the time as an appraiser for an auction house downtown, which meant she spent her days looking at things carefully and deciding what they were worth. We got along immediately, the way you do with people who see things the same way you do. We had dinner that night, the four of us, and Nora drank 2 glasses of wine and argued passionately about whether a certain 19th-century American furniture maker was overvalued in the current market, and I argued back, and Cal and Becca mostly watched us like they were at a tennis match. They hadn't expected to be so interesting. She left at 10:30. I stood at the door after she left and thought very clearly that I was not going to pursue that. The thought was immediate and specific and deliberate, like something I decided before I even knew I was deciding it. I was 7 months out of a marriage. I was not ready for anything. And more than that, I liked her. I liked her in the kind of way where the risk calculation was immediately obvious. So I became her friend instead. This is the thing about being friends with someone you are also, at some level, drawn to. You construct a life around the friendship that is real and genuine and valuable, and you convince yourself that the other thing is just background noise. You have dinner together. You go to the same parties. You text about things you read and things that annoyed you, and the specific frustrations of your respective jobs. She started her own appraisal practice 2 years after we met, and I helped her move her files and her reference books into the new office space, and we ate Thai food on the floor, surrounded by boxes, and she talked about how terrified she was, and I told her she was going to be fine. I was right. She was more than fine. She built something real, the way she does everything, with patience and precision and an honesty about what things were actually worth. Here is the rule I set for myself in the first year. I would not have a drink alone with her. Groups were fine. Dinner with Cal and Becca was fine. A party where there were 12 other people was fine. But I knew myself well enough to know that there was a version of this friendship that could tip over in the wrong conditions, and I decided the conditions would never be right. I was protecting the friendship. That was what I told myself. That was also true. The rule held for about 14 months. What broke it was a Tuesday in February, when she called me at 7 in the evening and said she had just had the worst client meeting of her career and she needed a drink, and Cal and Becca were in Bend for the week, and did I want to come over? I said yes before I finished processing the question. I brought a bottle of rye whiskey because I knew she preferred rye, which is the kind of information that accumulates without you meaning to let it, the way sawdust gets into the grain of your hands after enough years in a workshop. You stop noticing you know it, and it is just part of how you operate. We sat at her kitchen table until midnight. She told me about the client, who had turned out to be both dishonest and litigious, and I listened the way I always listened to her, with the specific attention of someone who is not waiting for his turn to speak, but is actually following the shape of what she is telling him. Then we talked about other things, and somewhere around 11 she laughed at something I said, and put her hand on my arm for just a moment, and then took it away, and I registered the exact weight and temperature of that contact, and noted it in the column I was not supposed to be keeping, and hated myself a little for it. I went home and thought that the rule had broken and nothing terrible had happened, and this was fine. I made a new rule. No more than once a month. Alone. And not past 10 o'clock. That rule lasted until April. What I did not let myself examine directly was what I actually felt when I was around her versus what I felt the rest of the time. I was good at the workshop. I understood things at the workshop. I would strip a piece of furniture down and look at the structure underneath and know exactly what I was looking at, what it needed, whether the repair was going to hold. What I could not do, apparently, was apply the same clear eye to myself. Gerald had a saying, "You can't read a piece of wood from inside the grain." He meant that you need distance to see the true shape of something. I had no distance from Nora. I had 11 years of proximity, which is the opposite of distance. In year 3 of the friendship, she dated someone named Marcus for about 8 months. He was a structural engineer, quiet and steady and tall, and he was good to her. I met him several times and found nothing wrong with him, which somehow made everything worse. She was happy with him. I could see that clearly. What I could also see, and tried very hard not to see, was the exact quality of her attention when she talked to me versus when she talked to Marcus. With Marcus she was warm and easy and affectionate. With me she was something slightly different. Sharper, more alive at the edges. I told myself I was inventing the distinction because I wanted it to be there. That was probably partly true. But I also knew how to read grain, and there is a difference between wood that is sound and wood that is only sound from one direction. What I did with the Marcus period was the thing I did with every uncomfortable piece of information about Nora and me. I turned it into evidence for my existing conclusion. She is happy with Marcus. Good. She deserves to be happy. I am her friend, and this is what friends feel. The fact that I drove home from the one dinner where Marcus had reached over and straightened a piece of her hair, and I had needed to pay very close attention to my driving for a while. That was not data I was going to let into the ledger. I filed it under the wrong column and moved on. Marcus moved to Chicago for work in year 4 of his relationship with Nora. They tried long distance for 4 months. It ended quietly. She was sad about it in the way you are sad about things that made sense to end even though they were good while they lasted. She did not call me dramatically. She texted me 3 days later and said she and Marcus had broken up and she was fine, mostly. And did I want to go to that new Ethiopian place on Division Street on Saturday? I said yes. Over injera and lentils, she told me what had happened with the same clear-eyed honesty she brought to appraising furniture, noting the structural weaknesses and the good original materials, and the fact that some things cannot survive a change in conditions no matter how well made they are. I listened. I said the right things. I did not say any of the things that were sitting right below the surface of the right things. The strange part was that the things I didn't say had been accumulating for so long by then that they had their own weight, like layers of old paint. Not saying them had become the structure of how I operated around her. Take that away and I didn't know what would be underneath. I was not sure I was ready to find out, and so I kept not saying, and the layers built up, and she kept being my closest friend, and we kept having dinner and texting and showing up for each other, and I kept believing that this was enough, and on most days it actually was enough, and that was the part that made it so easy to keep going exactly as we were. I made a new rule that night. I would not think about Nora Vega between the hours of 9 at night and 6 in the morning. Those were the hours I was most likely to do my most honest thinking, which meant they were also the hours I was most likely to admit things to myself that I had decided not to admit. So I ruled them out. What actually happened was that I thought about her constantly in those hours, in the way that a prohibition focuses the mind, but I had the additional layer of telling myself I was breaking a rule, which let me feel bad about it instead of just feeling it directly. I am aware this was not a sophisticated psychological strategy. I was a man who restored antique furniture in a warehouse in Portland, not a man who had developed healthy coping mechanisms for complicated feelings. 5 years ago, Becca and Cal got engaged. This meant Nora and I were going to be spending more time in the same orbit. Engagement parties, planning dinners, the general increased social density of people preparing for a wedding. Nora was Becca's maid of honor. I was Cal's best man. We were paired together in photographs at the engagement party, which is how I have a framed photograph in my workshop that shows Nora laughing at something happening off camera, her head tilted back, and me looking at her instead of at whatever she is laughing at. I have been aware of what that photograph shows since approximately the moment I first looked at the printed copy. I keep it on the shelf above the Windsor chair. The engagement lasted 4 years because Becca and Cal kept pushing the date. There were practical reasons, mainly financial, and then there was the pandemic, which pushed everything everywhere. Nora and I continued being friends through all of it. We navigated the strange compression of those years together, the way everyone did, and we came out the other side closer and more confirmed in each other's orbits. She came to my workshop once during lockdown to drop off reference books she thought I would find useful. She stood at the door because we were still being careful, and we talked for 45 minutes with the door open between us. And when she left, she said, "I'm really glad you're still here," meaning still in Portland, still in this life. I said I was glad she was, too. The conversation was true and clean, and it did not break any rules, because standing 6 feet apart in a doorway is not a condition under which anything tips over. But afterward I stood in the workshop for a long time before going back to the piece I was working on. The Windsor chair was still in the corner, still unfinished, still waiting for whatever it was waiting for. Now let me tell you about the 4 days before the wedding, because that is where the rules really started to go. Becca and Cal finally set a date last spring, late September, at a farm outside of Newburgh, 45 minutes south of Portland. A tent in a field, white lights, a barn for the dinner, the kind of wedding that looks effortless and takes months of planning. Nora coordinated most of it alongside Becca, which meant she was busy and stretched thin and running on the particular energy of someone who is managing a large thing by keeping every piece of it in their head simultaneously. I drove down Thursday afternoon for the setup and rehearsal, and I arrived to find Nora standing in the middle of the tent with a clipboard and a very specific expression, the one that meant she had identified a problem and was already 3 steps into solving it. I helped move tables. I am good at moving things. She directed me with the efficiency of someone who does not have time to be gracious about it, pointing to where things needed to go, and I went where she pointed. Around 5 o'clock, the big tasks were done, and the caterers had arrived, and there was a window of about an hour before the rehearsal dinner. Nora sat down on a hay bale near the edge of the tent and took her shoes off and pressed her feet into the grass, and I sat down a few feet away and watched the light going long and golden across the field. "You okay?" I asked. "I'm great," she said. "I'm just going to sit here without my shoes for exactly 15 minutes and then I'll be great out loud too." I said, "Take 20. She took 23, and neither of us said much, and it was the good kind of quiet. That is its own specific thing, comfortable silence with a specific person. It requires a long history. You cannot manufacture it. The rehearsal dinner was at the farmhouse, long tables and candles and the low hum of extended family finding their configurations. Nora sat across the table from me, not by plan but by the ordinary drift of where people end up. We talked across the table about a piece I was working on, an early American blanket chest with original painted decoration, and she asked the right questions, the ones that showed she actually understood what I was looking at, and I felt the very specific pleasure of talking to someone who follows your work without your having to explain the basic terms. After dinner, the family drifted toward the barn, and someone brought out bottles of local wine, and the evening turned slow and easy. This is when the first rule broke in a way I couldn't deny. Everyone else had drifted either to the barn or up to the farmhouse by 10:30. Nora and I were still at the end of the long table, and I had my jacket off by then, and she had her feet up on the chair beside her, and there was 1 bottle of wine still on the table with maybe 2 glasses left in it, and we were talking about nothing important, just the way a conversation goes when it has been going for a long time and has nowhere particular to be. And she said, "You know what I thought about during lockdown? That night we all went to Sauvie Island, and the boat got stuck." I said, "The motor died. The motor died and it started raining and nobody had a rain jacket and Cal just kept apologizing like he had personally arranged the weather. And Becca was furious." "Becca was furious," she said. "And you just started rowing. You didn't say anything. You just picked up the oar and started rowing, and I remember thinking, okay, this is a person who actually helps." She looked at her glass. "I think about that a lot when things feel stuck. I think someone is going to pick up the oar." I did not know what to say to that. I said, "It was a pretty short row." She smiled at her glass. "Yeah," she said, "it was." We sat in that for a moment. And then she said she should get some sleep and stood up, and I walked with her toward the farmhouse because we were both staying in the same general direction, and at the fork in the path where she went left toward the room she was sharing with Becca's college roommate, she stopped and turned. "Thank you for today," she said, "for showing up and just being useful." "That's me," I said. "Useful." She looked at me for a moment in the dark with those porch lights from the farmhouse making the whole scene amber and still. "No," she said, quietly, like she was correcting a small but important error. "That's not just what you are." And then she walked toward the house. I stood on that path for longer than I should have before going to find my own room. The rule about not drinking alone with her past 10 o'clock was now rubble, and I was standing in it. The next day was Friday, the day before the wedding, and it was full of the administrative chaos of a large event getting its final pieces in place. Florists, the sound system, a miscommunication about the rehearsal dinner menu that turned out to be fine but required 2 phone calls and 1 firm conversation. Nora was a machine. I watched her move through every problem with the same measured competence. Never frantic, never short with anyone, just clear about what needed to happen and then making it happen. She had always been this way. It is one of the things I had spent 11 years both admiring and using as a reason not to say certain things, because a person who is that self-possessed does not need anyone to handle anything for her, and I had never wanted to offer her something she didn't need. In the late afternoon, when the light had gone flat and the florists were finishing and the tent was finally starting to look like what it was supposed to be, I found Nora in the back corner of the tent, trying to retie a sash on one of the chair covers. Her hands were full. She heard me approach and said, without turning around, "The silk ones are impossible. I need a third hand." I came around behind her and took the 2 ends she was holding, and she stepped back slightly to give me room. And I worked the knot, the way you work a finishing knot on upholstery, slow and tight, making sure both sides were even. We were very close. She had her hair up by then, working hair for a working afternoon, and I could see the back of her neck and the small dark curls that had come loose at the nape. I finished the knot and said, "Done." She turned to look at it and nodded, reaching up to test the tension with 2 fingers. "Good," she said. "You're good at that." "Knots," I said. "Finishing things properly," she said, and turned to move on to the next chair, and I stood there 1 extra moment before I followed. That evening, after dinner, the wedding party gathered in the barn for a final rundown. Becca went through the order of the ceremony with the officiant, and Cal made everyone laugh with a toast that was mostly self-deprecating and entirely genuine. Nora sat beside me on a hay bale again, close enough that our arms were touching, and neither of us moved apart. This was not new. We had always been physically easy with each other in the way of people who have been friends long enough that personal space is a flexible concept. But I was aware of the contact in a way I usually managed not to be, and the awareness did not go away. After the rundown, I went to find the bathroom, which was in the far end of the barn. Coming back, I passed the small room where the wedding party's things were stored, and through the open door I could see Nora sitting on a wooden bench in the corner, her back to me, her shoulders slightly forward. She was looking at something in her hands. I almost walked on. I stopped. "Hey," I said. "You okay?" She turned, and in her hands was a small photograph, the kind printed on thick paper, the size of a playing card. She held it up briefly. It was a photo of her parents. Her father had died 4 years ago, just before the pandemic, and her mother had died when Nora was in college. "I always carry this to things like this," she said, "in case I need to talk to them for a second." I came in and sat down on the bench a few feet from her, not too close. She looked at the photograph for a moment longer, and then tucked it into the small bag on the bench beside her. "They would have loved this," I said. "Becca did a beautiful job. She really did." Nora was quiet. Then she said, "I keep thinking about how my dad would have danced. He was a terrible dancer. He would have been so happy dancing terribly." She exhaled a small laugh. "Sorry. I promised myself I wasn't going to cry until after the ceremony." "You've got time," I said. She turned to look at me. We were in a narrow wooden room with 1 light bulb overhead and the sound of the party beyond the wall, muffled and warm. "Owen," she said. "Yeah. Why is it always easier to be around you than anyone else?" I did not have a good answer. The honest answer was a thing I had been not saying for 11 years. The honest answer was, because you are the person I think about when something happens that I want to tell someone. Because when I finish a piece that I am proud of, your reaction is the one I imagine first. Because when I am in the shop at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night and the work is going well, I am sometimes composing a version of what I would tell you about it. Because you have been the constant thing. Because I have been carefully choosing, for 11 years, not to say any of this. What I said was, "We have good history." She looked at me for a moment like she was deciding whether to let that answer stand. She had the expression she gets when she is looking at a piece of furniture someone wants to sell, and she can see the condition is not what they think it is, and she is deciding how directly to say so. Then she said, "Yeah," quietly. "Yeah, we do." She picked up her bag and stood. "Come on, Cal is probably looking for his best man." I followed her out. I did not sleep well that night. What I did instead was lie in the dark in the farmhouse guest room and think about the question she had asked. Not the easy answer I had given it, but the actual question. Why is it always easier to be around you than anyone else? The fact that she had asked me that, the fact that she had phrased it as a genuine inquiry rather than as a compliment, like she actually wanted to understand the mechanism, the reason it was true. Like she had been examining this from her end and had reached the limit of what she could figure out alone. The morning of the wedding was clear and cold. That particular September cold that burns off fast when the sun gets high, and by noon the farm was glowing. The ceremony was everything it was supposed to be. Becca cried at the altar, and Cal's voice broke on his vows in the way that made every woman in the tent cry along with her, and Nora stood to one side in her dark green dress, with her hands folded in front of her, and watched her sister get married with an expression I have no adequate word for, something between pride and grief, and something that might be called fullness, the feeling of a thing that was supposed to happen finally happening. She had worked for months on this day, carrying every detail in her head, solving every problem before it surfaced, and now it was here, and it was right, and the relief in her was visible from where I was standing, 20 feet away, in a rented suit that fit well enough. I watched Nora instead of the ceremony. I was not proud of this, but I did not stop doing it. I watched her watch Becca and Cal, and I thought, there is the face of someone who knows exactly what she is feeling and is not apologizing for any of it. She cried during the vows, briefly, a single pass of her thumb under each eye, quick and practical, and then she composed herself and went back to looking at her sister with that expression. I thought about the storage room last night, the photograph of her parents in her hands, the way she had said I always carry this to things like this, in case I need to talk to them for a second. And then the question she had asked me, the one I had given the safe answer to. Why is it always easier to be around you than anyone else? I had not slept. I had been turning the question over all night like a piece of furniture I was assessing in the dark, running my hands over the surface without being able to see it clearly. By morning I had made a decision without quite naming it as a decision. By morning I understood that the next time she asked me something directly, I was going to give her a direct answer. After the ceremony came the photographs, which took an hour, and then cocktail hour, and then dinner, and the whole machine of a wedding doing what it does. I made the speech I had prepared for Cal, which was honest and not too long, and made people laugh at the right moments, and Cal clap-handed me on the shoulder after and said something into my ear that I couldn't hear over the noise but could feel was genuine. I ate dinner at the head table and talked to the people around me and drank one glass of champagne and switched to water because I wanted to be clear-headed tonight without quite knowing why. Nora gave her speech after mine. She talked about Becca with the precision of someone who has been paying close attention to a person for their entire life, catching the specific details, the way Becca always cuts the crusts off her sandwiches even now, the way she calls their mother's recipes by the names their mother called them, the small consistencies that make a person a person. She talked about Cal with the generosity of someone who loves her sister enough to truly welcome the man her sister chose. And then she said, there is a version of love that knows when it has found its right proportion. Becca found that, and I think that is the rarest thing. The tent was very quiet. I was looking at the centerpiece on my table, the mason jar with the wildflowers and the candle burning low. I was aware that something in my chest had changed position, the right proportion. I had spent 12 years in a workshop learning to recognize proportion, learning when a thing was in correct relation to itself, and when it was off by a fraction that looked small but changed the entire character of the piece. I understood proportion in wood and in structure, and in the relationship between a maker's intention and a material's nature. What I had not let myself understand, or had understood and refused to act on, was that I had been looking at the right proportion for 11 years, and I had been choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to leave it on the shelf. After dinner, the band started and the dancing started, and the evening got warmer and louder in the way of good receptions. I danced once with Becca's aunt, who insisted, and once with Becca herself, who hugged me hard and said, "I'm so glad you're Cal's best man." And I said, "Nowhere I'd rather be." I found my way back to the small table in the rear of the tent, the one away from the dance floor, and I sat there and finished a bourbon and thought about Nora's speech. The right proportion. I had been thinking about proportions for 11 years and had managed, consistently, to misapply the skill. I had been sitting there for about 20 minutes when I heard the band leader announce the bouquet toss, and the crowd shifted toward the dance floor. I did not move from my table. I heard the screaming and the laughing and the particular high note of a crowd reacting to something going right, and then I did not hear anything for a moment. And then I heard her, which is the way it has always been with Nora. In a crowd of 30 people, I locate her voice immediately. I do not try to. It just happens. And then she was sitting down across from me, peonies and garden roses on the table between us, her hair half down from whatever it had been earlier, both hands flat on the tablecloth. Not nervous. "Owen," she said. "Nora, I have a question." I picked up my glass. I took a slow drink. I set it back down. "Okay," I said. "Why have you been avoiding me since Thursday night?" Here is what I did not say. I have not been avoiding you. I have been sitting with you every available moment for 3 days, and the problem is the opposite. Here is what I said. I haven't been avoiding you. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has been appraising things professionally for 15 years and knows when the stated value does not match the condition of the piece. "You walked the long way around the barn twice today," she said. "You chose the seat at the opposite end of the head table at dinner. You have not looked directly at me for more than 2 seconds since Friday morning. Owen," she leaned forward, "I have known you for 11 years. The candle in the mason jar had burned about halfway down. The flowers in the centerpiece were starting to lean slightly, the way flowers do as an evening goes on, releasing whatever tension was holding them upright. Nora waited. She was very good at waiting. She had learned it the same place I had, from years of looking at things carefully before deciding what they were. I looked at her then, properly, the way I had been not looking at her all weekend. I said, "If I answer that question honestly, things are going to change." She did not look away. "I know," she said, "and I don't know which way they change." "I know that too." I picked up my bourbon glass. I looked at it. I set it back down. There was a long moment where the tent breathed around us, and the band played something slow. I thought about Gerald and his first rule. You do not start cutting until you know what you have. I had spent 11 years not cutting, not because I didn't know what I had, but because I was afraid of finding out I was right. The knowing was always scarier than the not knowing. The not knowing let me keep the friendship exactly as it was, warm and close and entirely reliable. And if I opened the question, then I risked all of it, every dinner and every text and every bottle of rye on a kitchen table, for an answer that might say no. A man who has lost one good thing has a very specific reluctance about risking another. I put my hands on the table. I looked at them, 2 hands that are good at understanding the structure of things, that have spent 12 years reading the grain of old wood and knowing what can be repaired and what cannot, that held 2 ends of a sash yesterday and made a knot that held. "You scare me," I said. "You specifically. Not in a bad way, in the way where I know exactly how much there is to lose," she said, quietly. "How long?" I did not pretend not to understand the question. "Since the night I met you," I said. "Give or take." She breathed out, not a sigh, not relief exactly, something more like recognition, the way you exhale when something confirms what you had been looking at from a distance for a long time, and you finally let yourself trust what you see. "Okay," she said. Okay, that's what I thought. She looked at the bouquet between us. She reached out and straightened one of the stems that had fallen sideways, the small automatic gesture of someone who can't help making things neat. I caught this on purpose, she said. I actually caught it. It came to me, but I positioned myself on purpose. I wanted a reason to walk over here, which is ridiculous because I didn't need a reason. You could have just walked over. I know. She looked back at me. But I wanted something in my hands, so I wouldn't do something awkward with them. I looked at her hands, still flat on the table. Very still. I thought about Thursday night on the farmhouse path, the way she had said no, that's not just what you are, like she had been carrying a correction ready for the right moment. I thought about 11 years of accumulated evidence I had been filing under the wrong heading. I put my right hand over her left hand. She turned her hand over and held mine. And that was the thing. That was the moment. Because it was exactly the weight and warmth I had been cataloguing since that Tuesday night at her kitchen table 3 years ago. Except now I was not pretending I hadn't noticed. Now I was not turning it into something I would file away and not examine. Her hand in my hand, it felt exactly the way it felt. Which was, I realized, the way it had always felt the few times we had ended up holding hands briefly at a crossing or climbing somewhere, and I had never let myself hold that for longer than the moment required. Now I let myself hold it. I have a rule, I said, about not ruining good things. That's a terrible rule, she said. It's been very useful. It's been keeping you in place, she said. There's a difference. I thought about the Windsor chair. I thought about it sitting in the corner of my workshop for 3 years, structurally perfect, every repair made, just waiting for the finish that would make it complete. I thought about how I had told myself I was still deciding on the right approach. I thought about how the problem with leaving things in that state is that eventually the shop gets dusty and you stop seeing what's right in front of you. Nora, I said. Yeah. I don't actually know how to do this. Neither do I, she said. But I know how to figure things out carefully. You do too. Her fingers closed around mine. We're both pretty good at that. The band had moved into something slower, and the tent had that late evening feel of a good party going soft at the edges, people leaning into their chairs, the hard work of the day done. Outside, through the gap in the tent wall, I could see the field in the dark and the stars above it that you can actually see from 40 minutes outside Portland. The sky clear the way it gets in late September, when the summer haze is finally gone. We stayed at the table. We talked for a long time. Not about what this meant or what it would become, because neither of us was that kind of person, the kind who needs to name and define and establish terms immediately. We talked about the things we talked about when we talked, which I suppose is its own kind of answer. She told me about a piece she had appraised that week, a small portrait she thought might be attributable to a specific painter from the 1870s, and how the attribution would change the value by a factor of about 12, and how you decide something like that, how you look at the evidence and make a call with what you have, knowing you might be wrong and making the call anyway, because not making it is also a choice, and it is a worse one. I told her about the blanket chest, the painted decoration, the way the original color was coming through under the later layers, a specific shade of barn red that would have been the fashionable color for that region in the 1850s, and how finding it felt like finding a note someone had left inside the piece, a message from the original maker to whoever was patient enough to look. That's what I love about your work, she said. You're always trying to hear what the thing is saying. You do the same thing, I said. I do, she said. It's probably why we've always understood each other. She said it simply, not making it into more than it was, just noting the fact of it. And it was the simplicity that got me, the way she said it like it had always been obvious, like there was no particular mystery about the two of us, like the thing I had been protecting as a secret had actually just been a thing we both already knew. Around midnight we walked out of the tent together into the cold air. The farm was quieting. The caterers were packing up the last of the tables. A few couples were still moving slowly on the dance floor to the band winding down, that end of the night swaying that is less about dancing than about not wanting to let the evening go. I could see Cal and Becca near the barn door, Becca's head on his shoulder, the two of them barely moving, looking like they had all the time they needed. Nora took my hand as we walked, not reaching for it, not making a moment of it, just taking it, the way you reach for something that belongs in your hand and has always been there. We walked to the fence at the edge of the field and stood there, looking out at the dark and the stars. "I drove down alone," she said. "I was going to leave tomorrow morning early. I have to open the office Monday." "I drove down alone too," I said. "You should come for dinner sometime this week," she said. "I'll cook. You can tell me more about the chest. I want to hear about the painted decoration." "Wednesday," I said. She looked at me. "Wednesday works." She leaned her shoulder against mine, just her shoulder, easy and familiar, and also different now in a way that is hard to put into words except to say that the same thing can be different when you stop keeping it at the edge of your attention and let it fully in. "This is going to be strange for a while," she said. "You know that." "I know. And then it won't be." I thought she was probably right about that. Nora was usually right about things she had been looking at carefully for a long time, and she had been looking at this for a long time. I understood that now. I understood, standing at the fence with her shoulder against mine and the field dark in front of us and the stars overhead, that I had not been the only one keeping something at the edge of attention. We had both been doing it. We had both been patient and careful and terrified in our own particular ways, and here we were on the other side of it, and the friendship was still there. It had not broken. It had, if anything, turned out to be stronger than I had given it credit for, sturdy enough to hold this new weight, because the best-made things always are. I drove back to Portland the next afternoon alone, the way I had come, the highway going north through the valley with the hills on either side still green from the late summer. The drive was about 45 minutes, and I did not listen to anything. I just drove with the windows cracked and the cold air coming through and the feeling of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally set it down, not gone, not resolved into something neat and finished, just set down. There is a difference between a thing being over and a thing being put in its right place. The right place is still weight, but a different kind. I got to my workshop at 4 in the afternoon. I still had my dress shirt on, jacket in the back seat. I unlocked the shop and went in and stood for a moment in the smell of sawdust and oil and old wood, the smell that means work and patience and the slow accumulation of time spent with things that are worth understanding. It was the smell of my life, the actual shape of it, and for the first time in a long time it did not feel like a room I had retreated into. It felt like a room that was mine. The Windsor chair was in its corner. I went over and picked it up and carried it to the center of the shop, into the light from the big window that faces west, where the late afternoon sun comes in flat and honest and shows you exactly what you have. I set it down and stepped back and looked at it the way you look at something when you are finally ready to see it without deciding in advance what you will find. The seat was beautiful. The single piece of tulip poplar, that slow, continuous curve, still smooth and clean from the sanding 3 years ago. The spindles were straight and tight, not a loose joint in any of them. The comb back had a slight asymmetry in the original turning that was not a flaw but a signature, a mark of the particular hand that had made it. The small variations that prove something is real and not a reproduction. Every piece of it was sound. I had known that for 3 years. I had been standing across the shop from it for 3 years, knowing it and not moving on it. There are things you know and things you act on. The gap between them is where most of life happens, and most of the waiting, and most of the slow accumulation of days in which you are almost where you want to be. I went to the supply cabinet and got the oil finish I had bought about a year ago and never opened. Tung oil, which is what you use on antique American pieces with open grain that need protection without obscuring the figure of the wood. I opened the can and the smell of it hit me the way familiar smells do, clean and sharp and right for the work. I got a rag and I started with the seat. The wood drank it in. That is not a metaphor. Dry wood that has been waiting for its finish will absorb the first coat almost immediately, pulling the oil in like it has been thirsty, the color deepening as it goes, the figure of the wood coming forward, the way it always does when you give it what it needs. The tulip poplar went from pale and flat to something golden and alive. I worked slowly, following the grain, keeping the coats thin and even. Gerald always said, a thin coat you can build on is worth 3 thick coats that bubble and need to be sanded back. Patience produces better results than urgency. That rule, at least, I had always understood. I spent 2 hours on the first coat. By the time I was done, the light had gone out of the window and I had turned on the shop lights and the chair sat in the center of the room, looking like what it actually was. A very beautiful, very old, very well-made object that had survived everything that had happened to it and come out on the other side with its essential structure intact. There is a moment in restoration when a piece stops being a project and becomes what it was always meant to be. Gerald called it the moment of recognition. You look at the thing and you know, this is it. This is what it actually is. Not what it was when it arrived. Not what it was in the middle of the process, but what it is now, at the end, when all the work has been done and all the damage has been addressed, and what remains is the thing itself, completed and ready. And then you can stop treating it as something in progress and start treating it as something real. I put the brush down and wiped my hands on the rag and stood there in my dress shirt with sawdust on the cuffs, looking at a chair that had been waiting 3 years for me to finish it, and I thought, there it is. That is what this was, the whole time. I thought about Nora taking my hand at the fence, not reaching for it but just taking it, the quiet certainty of that gesture. I thought about the way she said my name in that storage room with the photograph of her parents in her hands, that particular quality of directness that is one of the most specifically Nora things about her, the refusal to approach something sideways when she can just say it plainly. I thought about 11 years of dinners and text messages and bottles of rye whiskey on kitchen tables and photographs on hay bales and conversations about whether 19th century furniture makers were overvalued. I thought about the way she corrected me on the path. No, that's not just what you are. The first coat was in. The chair needed 2 more, with drying time between them. I would do the second coat tomorrow. The third coat would be dry by Wednesday. She had said dinner this week. Wednesday was this week. I turned off the shop lights. I locked the door. I drove home through Portland on a Sunday night with the streets quiet and the city doing what cities do when the daytime business is over, settling into itself. I had the window down and the air was cold and I was thinking about what to bring to dinner Wednesday. I was thinking about the blanket chest and the questions she would ask about it. I was thinking about Becca and Cal at the barn door, barely moving, looking like people who had nowhere else to be. There is a version of love that knows when it has found its right proportion. Nora had said that about Cal and Becca, standing at the head table in a green dress with her hands folded, looking at her sister getting married. She had been right. She is usually right about the things she has been examining carefully from close range for a long time. I thought I would bring the chair to dinner on Wednesday. It would be finished by then. All 3 coats, all dried, all buffed out to the finish it had been waiting for. I would put it in the back of the truck and bring it to her apartment, and it would be something to carry through the door, something in my hands, the way the bouquet had been something in hers, something to make the threshold easier. I thought that was probably the right idea. I am, as it turns out, pretty good at knowing what belongs where. Once I finally let myself look at the thing directly and stop deciding in advance what I will find.